Hello there. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Blockchain Socialist, and I have a really interesting interview today with Rich Jensen, who is the cooperative executive of Resonate, a cooperatively owned music platform. So, hi, Rich. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Hello.
So you've been in the music business for a long time, and you've been around, and I know that you've worked on different projects before. So before we get into what Resonate is, I think it'd be really interesting if we can maybe put it a bit into context. If you want to talk a little bit about your own history in music and what you've sort of the projects that you've worked on and what got you to Resonate.
Yeah, thank you. When I reflect on how I got involved in the Resonate project and its relationship to technology, I think about a couple of other sort of times that I fell through a magic doorway into different technological situations or conditions. And a lot of it goes back to in my late teens, and I'm old, so my late teens were occurring pretty much in sync with, say, the hardcore punk rock tradition out of the West Coast of the United States. So in the early 1980s, I happened to attempt to be a college student in this town called Olympia, Washington. And there were very interesting conditions there around 1980 and 81, where the music director of the community radio station had instituted or helped with the community members that supported that radio station that was facilitated by the college. There are a lot of these around the country or around the world, but in this particular case, John Foster got the community members to support a policy of 80% of their music content would come from independent sources rather than the major labels, the major corporate sources. And it wasn't 100%, it was 80%. So it was a preponderance. And what was interesting about that in one case was that it was not an aesthetic qualification. It wasn't about being obscurantist or highfalutin in one's taste. All genres were still open to be played, but it was really a critical boundary drawn around the social and economic conditions of the production and distribution of the music that was being targeted. So that happened in the mid 70s, and so by the time I got to Olympia, and like I say, I messed around as a student for about a year there before music swept me away, and the possibilities of working with my friends to create a world other than the Ronald Reagan mutually assured destruction that was popular and mainstream at the time. Looking for other ways to organize socially and communicate through art and so forth. Anyway. So what I encountered there since that happened, the policy started, I think, in 1976. By the time I got there 5 years later, what that meant was there was an amazing archive of otherwise difficult to find music in one room. And it's hard for people to understand what that meant pre-internet. But geographical location and whether you had access to a room where there was cool stuff and people that knew about it and could communicate about it and help you quickly find what your interest or what work may need to be done, or hey, you like this artist, you might like that artist. It happened that there was a community built around this archive of otherwise difficult to find material that really turned me on to the possibilities of music. And
this is a time, for our younger listeners, pre-internet, before you could just Google search everything.
Yeah, like 10 years before the internet. Sure.
So I was curious if you could explain a bit what you meant before. You mentioned how this wasn't the decision to get music that wasn't from corporate labels was sort of a economic decision.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was consistent with really, it's as far as I can tell, this ethos, this kind of critical analysis of culture, was identified as independent, and so it happened that John Foster, not only did he, instigate this policy, which then provoked this archive and community, but it was a tactical decision against corporate monopoly in terms of media culture. It was saying, let's have the smaller, rather than the monoliths, which already dominate. At that time, it was tossed around that 98% of all music on all broadcast on all radio stations. And again, we had no internet, we had no other means of except
no SoundCloud.
The radio was as broad a distribution of information as was available, or the mail. Actually, like, I was going to key off that the technology that was really fascinating to me and that I got involved with my friends was cassette tapes, because they could be recorded and then mailed all over the world. And there were mail networks sending music around the world, because what was amazing to find when you go into an archive like this is that culture doesn't happen as cause and effect. That's one of my theories, is the cultural change happens as a matter of grammar, of linguistics. Like, as you have a grammatical structure that allows for new conceptions, those conceptions occur independent of geography. So what we got to see in this time in the early 80s with the punk rock culture, and it could have been any genre, any style, just that was something that young people had taken up in their time. So if you wanted to be connecting with people who were 20 years old in Moscow and Berlin and Lawrence, Kansas, all over the world, it was actually through cassette tapes and radio stations that were playing cassette tapes and so on. That was the decentralized technological innovation coupled with a particular critical analysis of media culture that I happened to stumble into as a young person, and it just felt right. It just felt right to me, because kind of the family I grew up in was anti-Vietnam War and all those kinds of things that we relate to the 60s. And so in general, as a young person, I thought the world was not organized as it should be, and so was looking for alternatives. And rather than, at the time, the adults elected Ronald Reagan to run our country, and I know around the world we had, Margaret Thatcher was similar. This conservatism just didn't make any sense. It just seemed like a dead end project. And honestly, now it's almost 40 years later, and I've been convinced and been able, I've been working on this idea that they're alternative. Not only they're alternative ideas, but that the best ideas emerge from decentralized community and cultural contexts. That it's basically it's the intelligence of a swarm, rather than trying to have a particular point of information. But I digress. We were talking about the 80s.
Yeah. No, I think it's still, because I was going to ask you, how exactly did those networks of people exchanging cassette tapes, how were they made? And was there any relation to, was there a political relation in the fact that punk rock cassette tapes were being passed around
well,
between people?
It all came together because of the people that happened to be in my town. And this archive that had accumulated. So it's easy to find out where the other nodes of the network were, because you could just look at a record and see the address of the people that had put it out. And again, the qualifier was that these weren't the monopolistic distribution networks. These were the people handling the other part of the business, which is necessarily, I don't know, it's not necessarily anti-capitalist, but it's a critical capitalism. It's about small businesses. It's about independent startups. And I really prefer to look at those opportunities and kind of try to disaggregate, what's the real when someone starts a record label and as it's got even less likely that you're going to be able to sustain yourself. The question of sustainability can be divorced from the question of ownership of property, right? We don't need, we could probably figure out, we don't need to go whole hog and closure and destroy the commons. There may be intermediate steps where if I can figure out how to sustain the operation through a crowd, then I can continue to pursue something which is unlikely as a business project, but valuable as a social and cultural project, right? And it happens that emergent culture, capital, I'm sorry to kind of just jump around here and go to some of my themes, but capital has no creativity. Capital is just a number, is just a pile of money. It doesn't know what's going on. People, as agents in the culture, human beings are where the culture emerges from, based on their kind of iterative capacity to play with whatever the existing cultural and linguistic field is around them. And so emerging culture always comes from the relatively less supported, capitalized regions of culture. That's where, because you have to survive, you have to be creative, and the creativity spills over into other places. And so what we've seen in the music business is really very much a colonial project, where you've got the fort full of money and property relations all established, and then you try to send scouts. They're actually called scouts, that go out to try to find out what's going on out there in the world. What are the kids up to? The kids are up to something, not to be commercial, but just to have fucking fun in a world in crisis. And if you figure out how they're able to sustain themselves and produce something interesting, then you bring that back to the fort, and then they run out with attorneys to make property out of it. Now, I'm all for trying to figure out how can creative people give all of their time just in confronting the existential crisis of being alive, which is, how do we support the people that are working on the next iterations of our culture, and those particularly which may be about supporting the earth, particularly through the crisis of the next 10 years. How do we support those people so they can just imagine and orient themselves and aggregate in community as best they can? How do we support that? That's not necessarily a small business model, but I've gone off on this tangent just, to take it back to this historical point in time. So this is kind of what the benefit was of having this critical framework of, we're not going to deal with corporate structures. We're going to deal with everybody that's handling the edge cases, the 5% of the business that's not under these corporate distribution networks. Is that 5% is the place where emergent culture is going to be found. And that's what, so we started to have fun with that. Now, within that particular context, I was very fortunate. In this little town were people a couple of years older than me who, again, the decentralized culture of the time, making your own fanzine. We started to we had copy machines that we could go to. You didn't have to set type. So to watch these kinds of basically it permitted new voices to be able to spread their information over greater geography because the barrier to entry was reduced. And so then you get to curate among these different voices and sources. And so I was very lucky to kind of stumble into a really interesting conversation of new people with new things to say, taking advantage of new technologies. The point I'm really trying to make about this in 1981 and 2 and 3 is that I experienced it again when I was basically running operations for the Sub Pop record label, which happened because I first encountered Sub Pop 10 years previous in 1981 because it was a fanzine that a fellow named Bruce Pavitt, who happened to we became friends, and in the kind of the social milieu of my little region of the world. And Sub Pop, you can tell by the name of being underground pop, was, the people that were behind. There's a magazine. John Foster was the editor that I mentioned before as the music director at KAOS FM. Had a magazine he was the publisher of a magazine that was also a fascinating decentralized project called Op Magazine, which was committed to all genres of music, coming out worldwide through independent distribution means. Bruce Pavitt was a person who really liked pop music, but looked at how could what was the underground pop? So he was interested in the tradition of rock and roll, or whatever that was. 1982, you might call it post-punk now. At the time, we called everything punk. Since then, people have kind of parsed it, whatever. But Bruce was very interested in that tradition and the social organization that could come from accessible, loud, disruptive music forms. And he was collating them and collecting them for his fanzine, which called Sub Pop, Subterranean Pop, which I think his first edition was in 1979. I met him in 81. And by 83, he was alternating the print publication with a cassette of curated material. There were other cassettes, an influence there was a magazine out of Australia called Fast Forward, which also was, I think, identified as what they called a cassettazine, or it's like cassette was naturally. I don't know if you're familiar with I think it's Samizdat was is kind of like was a decentralized fanzine form in Russia before in the final stages. So the cassette was perfectly designed to be a kind of Samizdat for audio.
And a fanzine, maybe you can explain a bit what that's like. It's a magazine.
Yeah. A fanzine. A fanzine means, I mean, they go back in history, but they were always, they were published. Well, a fanzine now, a zine culture, for those who don't know, is just any like independently produced publication, using copiers. Nowadays, I mean, it's basically like a physical blog. People know nowadays people might know what a website or a blog is. That might be their natural go-to. But if you made a physical artifact of like, I'm just so-and-so, and here's my idea, or here are my friends, again, before the internet, just doing this kind of physical curation of culture and making the artifact. And then because distribution was a problem, so you had to get that effort, make a physical artifact, and then distribute that physical artifact around. And that's not to say that the internet isn't also physical. It's just you don't have to think about it as much because we're just using electron calls. Well, again, I don't want to get. That's kind of not to say that there aren't electrons in paper, but I'm trying to be very
slightly different, yeah.
precise in my language. The difference is culture. I mean, this is what's interesting. This is I think this is a great time for people to reflect on what culture is, and culture, because culture, I think culture is it's about time. Culture is about instantiating a symbol, a kind of a constellation of symbols in such a way that it can be distributed over time and space.
Like it's recognized by a significant amount of people.
Yeah, and not even, and yes, and I would say it's not even a human attribute, but we see it's about signaling meaning, and but having your dictionary at this point in time and in this place being readable in another time and place, and that process by which you do that, its materiality is the materiality of culture, and then the content, the kind of the symbol meaning that gets transmitted. That's the what is that? That's the content of culture, I guess. And both those things need to be realized. The point is, the reason why this matters to me, and I'm sorry that I'm kind of roaming all over the place, is that culture, I think you get culture as a byproduct of a high degree of cognitive processing. And so you can see populations of primates, and there are different animals that we see in the wild. Bees transmit information about their dance. They've learned their dance back in the hive is the distance and direction of a pollen source that they bring back to the hive, and they communicate. And so these kinds of what the advantage might be of extending beyond your body and using information from the world and then conveying it to your community, those things are organic and ancient. They're millions of years old. It just happens that we have the equipment as humans that we have at this time now. So the point of that is that culture is not a commodity. People don't realize that. Culture comes before the commodity game. How to extract resources through our modern civilization and these practices that we've evolved. That can be interesting. It's actually headed toward a very destructive place by all measures. So we need to change the gamification of that economy. But that's those are legacy economic practices on top of something which is organic and ancient and available to us. So my way of thinking has been that if we can turn on this organic cultural capacity to the people that are leading in imaginative ways and support them, that's the best way to try to make it through this extinction gap that we're facing on a planetary scale. And it just happens that for me, music has been that, to me, music is when you take that problem of getting outside your body and taking information to the world. It's when you take that kind of technical problem and add a layer of lyricism to it, add poetry to it, add ambiguities of meaning, but embrace the consonants and the possibilities. That's really that's one of the qualities of music. It's also just an incredibly efficient way for people to exteriorize their interior conditions. So when there's a new way of feeling in the world, music can transmit that very, very, very efficiently. And so that's why music is always tied with new movements and zeitgeist. This thing called, the spirit of the time is often transmitted because music is incredibly efficient architecture. You're just vibrating. It is architecture. It's spatial. We call it volume. When we turn up the knob, we increase the volume of the vibrations, but we're just vibrating air. So it's one of the most efficient architectural interventions possible. And that's why it's that those efficiencies are what have drawn it to me. And it's been interesting, so I've been able to play around with navigating through the world now for 40 years. And I owe it to, some of these insights of critical intervention around culture back to the 80s. And then obviously it happens in my community. I met a guy named Bruce Pavitt who met up with a guy named John Poneman in Seattle in the late 80s, started something called a record label, which was a business operation to sustain a community of people doing work around artists that was on its own terms. A couple of dollars were put together by some people, but it also was based on subscriptions. It really was a crowdsourced format. There was a thing called Single of the Month Club. So all of these, I think it's really helpful. One of the things that somebody who's old like me can offer is that there are social formations that kind of rhyme with other social formations. The world is not entirely new again simply because of a technological intervention. There are analogies to be drawn and antecedents to be seen that have emerged from the culture. And I do think it's relevant that, as an independent label, Sub Pop did not get grants from any government. I mean, Bruce earned credit back in the early 80s from a public institution as a student. And there's no doubt that there was a lot of state-sponsored resources that helped the radio station and all those things. But my point is that I think it's handy to kind of keep a certain distance from these ideological tropes and just get shit done and use ideology as it might be useful to identify different potential allies and sometimes when people go deep on ideology, there's baggage that comes along and you've got to kind of check. So it's a kind of indicator of what baggage other people might be carrying, which depending on your capacity to engage them, maybe you can educate them and they can leave some baggage behind and you can still work together. My point. Anyway, I'm just kind of I'm trying to steer it toward the.
I see what you mean. Are you saying that it's dangerous for me to call myself a socialist?
What's that?
You're saying it's dangerous for me to call myself a socialist?
No. I respect your courage. No. I mean, fair. I'll tell you what. One of the things that occurred to me, because I've been looking at cooperatives more. I've been researching and now I'm involved as the executive of a cooperative. And one of the things that I find very satisfying about the cooperative, there are a number of things about the cooperative form that I like. But one of them is that you have a membership and you have a project, and the practice is we're doing this project and we're going to sustain the project, and you're transparent and open about what you're doing and what we're going to do when we do the project. So you got kind of it's a small frame, and it's where people are participating in it as much as they want to participate. Now, and practice itself is independent of ideology that the others might bring. And one of the things, and again, since we're talking, to people that are interested in the combination, some intersection of blockchain and socialism here, there are many things that are very, like, if I could have a project, like I've just noticed that the people that want more state and more public institutions and so forth, and public guarantees and protections, particularly for oppressed people and so on, and think that we need something socially to support that, they tend over to the socialist side. And then people who think that in itself is pernicious, and they're very wary of states going out of control, they often look to a non-statist solution, and some of them end up wanting to talk about themselves as libertarians or whatnot, and they hang out with libertarian friends. I think that whole discussion is completely beside the point if you're making a project that is serving all people and is open and transparent. But there, what it matters is if you're really serving those people, or whether, like, are they actually in the room with you doing the project? That's the next level for me. And that's where my attention is right now for our project, is finding out what's out there, and so, for example, it's been great to build with Black socialists in the United States, Twitter handle Black Socialists, who are taking on the racist institutional structures that are foundational in the United States, and looking and building cooperative and supporting cooperatives like Cooperation Jackson out of Jackson, Mississippi. So cooperative community structures based, in with a critical stance opposing some of these legacy structures. To me, like, if we can be facilitating the members of organizations like that in our work, facilitating and that they want to work with the project, that to me is an indicator that we're beginning to have the right community built, that if we suss among ourselves what are the structures to apply from this community, that we'll be heading in an interesting direction. To me, those are really interesting questions. Sorry, I've gone way off the field, but just trying to kind of hopscotch my way through to give you some sense of context about what I'm thinking about these days.
Well, I think that's really interesting. Maybe that's because you mentioned that you're working with them. Maybe that's a good point to just transition and just like explain a bit what Resonate is,
Sure.
And what it's meant to, what type of problems it's meant to fix.
Sure. So Resonate is a project originating in 2016, founded by Peter Harris, who launched a crowdsourced project to basically build a cooperative streaming platform. That was successful. Several hundred people, many of whom were involved in music, contributed through the crowdsource initiative. By 2017, the organization was registered as a for-profit cooperative business, meeting the structural obligations required by the Republic of Ireland, so we're based in Dublin, which is an EU territory. And project got underway, and then along the way, there was a blockchain cooperative project based in Seattle, where I am, called R-Chain, that very interesting project based on an alternative to lambda calculus, just some really interesting principles at the heart of that project. And it was also interesting that it was organized as a cooperative. And it just happens that because of some friends of mine in the town, I heard about this, and like cassettes in 1981 and like the internet in 1991, when I was at Sub Pop and got us on the internet, it was like, oh, okay, well, the nerds have been building something interesting. There's some really interesting services and capacities here. And it happened that, so I came in and was introduced to Resonate through the technical project of that time, which was 2018, and then met Peter and so forth, and started to understand that through distributed ledger technologies, some really interesting new services were available for locking in information in a transparent way, and also identity, self-sovereign ID as a service really began to fascinate me, and how that might relate to trust, and the individual participants in a community could build information networks with their peers through trust in a way that was peer-to-peer based and symmetrical, not supporting the asymmetries of so many other projects out there, basically Web 2.0. So like I had been earlier, I was kind of inflamed with these ethical and social possibilities. And so Resonate is a community that has its origin in that crowdsourced project. We are a website, we're a cooperatively managed streaming service. That is to say, we provide a service similar to, say, Spotify, but rather than being, a mask for surveillance capitalism, we're intending to build, based on an peer-to-peer identity platform that's entirely opposed to that framework, and we're democratically managed by our members. We have different stakeholders, where we have artists, listeners, developers, and workers, collaborators on the project, or the different membership categories. At present, we are about 1,500 members, and we have, I believe, close to 10,000 artist sources. That's not necessarily all artist members, because we have made alliances with distributors and some labels. So they've made the rights that they have to share through the network as part of where our content is. We have among all these other ethical things that I find interesting, and are sort of the groundwork of the framework, we have a business proposition, which is basically we pay about double Spotify's rate to stream. Every play through our network is paid. Bandcamp does amazing work for the community, but they're not based on a streaming model. So the streaming that occurs off of Bandcamp is strictly promotional. They're selling whole units. We're trying to make a sustainable business model out of micropayments. The way it works is you don't have to be a member, but to be a user of the music platform. Well, for one, it's free to artists, so artists can become members simply by uploading their own content. We can't handle any kind of sample. It has to people represent their own work. And then as listeners, you basically open a wallet of €5, and you then spend a really small amount of money for each listen, and it doubles each time you listen. So as you kind of connect with a piece of music, you end up each pay to play or stream to own is what we call it, but each doubles until essentially it's kind of based on the old iTunes model at about €1. You've obtained download rights to that content. The artist has received €1 for the content, and like I say, when we look at since 2007, when we opened our streaming service, if you look at the payment made for every play, there have been at this point over 1 million plays. The average rate of payout is double the Spotify rate. So I guess what I've spoken to is sort of my own trajectory and history and enthusiasm for the cooperative model and for this case. But those are the basic terms. And we're working with other like-minded organizations, and basically, I think music is the magic doorway through which we build a cooperative world economy and a democratic economic space that we all can participate in.
Yeah. So if I were to like very quickly summarize what Resonate is it's really like a cooperatively owned Spotify, but that change in that ownership structure really fundamentally changes a lot of other different things and produces a lot of, benefits to the actual artists who are creating the content for the platform, and that they get paid more per play, and then users using this system are eventually able to download the music that they really like if they play it so many different times, and basically the artist is being incentivized, or I guess they're rewarded for the fact that a person likes their music more rather than like playing it once and tossing it to the side, maybe.
I say that we're not competing with Spotify. Because I'm really interested in that active listener. So we're not interested in like there's a small percentage of people for whom music is really important, and we want to be serving that community and amplifying the sort of critical capacity and the economic impact, and to sustain that critical relation, that active relation to music. That's sort of the segment. That's one area where Spotify's function and many of these mass scale, by going to the mass scale and accentuating the quantitative rather than the critical qualitative, or that's just a different project. And also the other way that I would say we distinguish is that this relationship to identity and self-sovereign identity and identity control is really important, because the business model, for one, Spotify's a IPO hustle. They all look glamorous because they raised I don't know how many billion on Wall Street. They've rarely been profitable. So people, particularly in difficult economic times, want to figure out how to have that casino ticket that wins. And many artists are chasing, they're chasing a quantitative. They want big numbers. Going back through my history, I've seen big numbers follow cultural significance, and so it's people that are watching. That's my discussion about about the way culture happens. If you can be culturally significant, the market can come, or support can come. That's what I witnessed in my local community in the Northwest with this thing called #grunge or whatever in the 90s was people just basically building a structure where they could support themselves outside of the existing media culture. Eventually built a culture over 10 years through meeting each other, sleeping on each other's floors, recognizing, boosting each other as artists without this, there's a certain level of monetary reward. Like, we all need time to do our work, but beyond that, it starts to be, some antisocial attributes almost naturally fall out of chasing those quantities. So anyway, those two things, I think trying to focus on a critical conversation within the community about how to support emerging culture that is here for the long term and what are the conditions for that, and keeping that conversation going is really essential to us. And that's different than I think the conversation that naturally is going to occur at Spotify. And
Yeah.
then also, being resolutely opposed to surveillance capitalism as a business model. And then appealing to people. That's the thing that I've just been seeing since I've, part of what motivated me to really want to get involved with Resonate, and what motivates many of the allies that are coming in, and there has to be a better way. And so people are looking for alternatives. And if we get all the people that are looking for those alternatives around the table and around the community and building, and it'll this is why I'm optimistic. I can't,
Yeah.
there's no empirical proof. It's just the kind of faith that has led me now for decades, and at least it's made this an interesting time.
I can tell you're excited about it. But so I wanted to bring this up a little bit because
Yeah.
I've talked about it a bit in previous sort of talks that I've done about blockchain. I really like to relate the structure of blockchain as being peer-to-peer to other peer-to-peer technologies,
Yes.
and a really big turning point in music. I think for mine and a lot of people's lives was when peer-to-peer networks were used for the exchange of music, similar to like these cassettes that you're talking. I guess the cassettes were sort of like the prehistoric age of like Napster.
Sure. No,
So
that's interesting. Yeah, that's
I
interesting. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it changed everything. I remember just whenever,
It really
you could just
did.
go on and get whatever you want. And so but what I want to say about that is that
Yeah.
from the research that I've done, you see that as soon as Napster hit, total revenue of the music industry plummeted.
Yes.
And even still today, it hasn't reached that same amount of total money.
Right.
Profitability maybe could still be higher but then you had like a few years later, you had the iTunes store that tried to use the sort of digital platform of Napster, but now you just have to pay for it, and it's a sleek design, and you can put it on your iPod.
Yeah.
So basically, the point I'm trying to say is that the music industry, like this sort of peer-to-peer revolution, created like a very material effect on the industry as a whole. What I would sort of think is that cooperatives are more like peer-to-peer, or peer-to-peer technology is more like a cooperative. I mean, it's not a perfect comparison, or perfectly similar. So to me, I feel like seeing a music platform like Spotify, which I think is a response to Napster. Like Spotify would not exist without, I think, if Napster never did before that. But to create that and to still fuse more aspects of Napster, in the sense that it's maybe Napster wasn't a cooperative, but Resonate is a cooperative. So you have those different type of relationships between the different artists and the user and the artist. So to me, what's really exciting about Resonate is that it seems to bring in more of these attributes, and it seems to be like a natural evolution of music, especially in the digital age.
No, I think you're describing something that's very important. And I guess again, kind of applying, and I appreciate your bringing the historical view. Um, and yes, I think that is it. What it is fascinating to watch that graph. Everyone should look at that graph
Yeah.
of global music industry receipts. It's actually, there's a version of it that goes from the 70s to the present, and to look at the change in distribution formats. So from vinyl, see the share that's cassette, see the share
Mm.
that's downloads, see the share that's CDs, and then watch it plummet in 2000 when Napster really took off, and then watch it come back with streaming. So when you
Yeah.
look at it over time, you kind of see a give and take between, it's an economic measure of what are the people, what are the average people, what are the masses able, how are they going to participate in these institutional forums, in these business forums. And yeah, and so there have been three very different periods. I mean, there's, actually 91 is when the CD really took off from vinyl. And then 99 is when the share really took off from everything else. And so I agree that I think the sentiment that we maybe where we come full circle, and maybe what we see in that sort of dialectical conversation of like, I'm willing to pay $15 for this independent CD versus I'm just going to download it for free, is part of it is a recognition. I think when people subscribe to a service every month, they're saying, I want to be a part of this community. It's, I think Matt Dryhurst has some really interesting discourse these days. Someone that advises Resonate, is a close friend to Resonate, has argued for, I've told you a story about independent music being critical from corporate music, but he's like he some of his rhetoric, he takes on independence as a kind of, kind of romantic, heroic, libertarian perhaps trope of rugged individualism, and argued for interdependence in music. And I think the service, maybe what you're describing is a recognition of social interdependence, that as a listener, I could get that product for free, but if I'm actually having a relationship with this creator, I want to help them continue to create, and recognizing one's complicity in the community. And I think that's really important. And to me also, like, where I imagine it going, and where, when I first saw what blockchain was, and again, the primacy of trust and identity, like that I could only reveal myself to people I trusted, and like the idea of hooking that up with like, this is sort of the vision that I imagine, and I hope that I'd like to see Resonate have the technical capacity to build. But you can liberate by disaggregating the commodity from the cultural form, and then focusing on the cultural as a social practice. One could start to let things realize their interdependency of value, right? Because say I'm the heir of a my dad is on the board of directors and is worth $2 billion. And for whatever reason, I have access to a castle in Spain. I might contribute that to my trust community to have creators come and provide a festival, or have people come and have house an orchestra to record a project. That you might contribute your resource to the community for the benefit of the creation, rather than having, as a direct kind of a barter action, as a transaction between trust or across cooperative communities, rather than having to, play a game of converting it to some currency form and then back out as it could just be an open conversation. And in a world where capitalism has and commodification of natural community resources, capitalism has, by playing the commodity game, one thing that we've done is we've filled the world with unused assets. Like, there's all kinds, like, it's a distribution problem. We have all the wealth we need. We have all the space we need. We have everything we need. It's just, it's held up by property contracts, and it's not democratically managed. And if, for example, we could simply, through appreciation of art, music, and come up with different forms of transaction to re-socialize these surplus assets, instead of pointing guns at people, I would rather see that, because bombs and guns are really destructive and have a lot of bad byproducts. And I have to believe that in most cases, it's it's a kind of miseducation, or some anxiety issues that have people clinging to property contracts rather than sharing the good fortune that they may control.
No, I definitely. I think music, I mean, maybe art in general, is just a great sort of vehicle for using new technologies and like for testing new technologies, especially.
Right.
But so I wanted to make this sort of connection because you've mentioned this a lot about commodification, is that, you know, what you see, basically Napster was sort of, I would say, more or less a decommodification of music, where, I mean, it was just a free for all. You can get as much music as you want. There's nothing really that stopped you as long as it was available. And then you had sort of this backlash of artists, record labels, different companies saying like, oh no, we can't make money now because everyone just keeps getting their music for free. And I remember, I don't know, there's this like a South Park episode, I think, of just like, oh no, Britney Spears won't be able to get her 20 karat, encrusted pool. Now it'll only be 18 karat. So you had like sort of like, is also kind of funny, but there is, I think, a bit of a real argument for smaller artists, you could say, who aren't supported by, corporate, record labels. So, it's more difficult for them to make money because of Napster, you could say as well. You could say that they were possibly a victim of it. But, then you have this dialectic where you're going back and forth, and now you have this corporate push with Spotify and with all these different platforms. And now what looks like could be a response back to where you finally are able to at least answer more of the problems and the questions of, decommodifying music, but also making sure that those who produce the content are able to bear fruits of their work, essentially.
Well, and it's very interesting, because we didn't talk about it much on this call, but people can see, I was introduced to Sub Pop socially in 81 and then started working there in 91 and basically ran the label from an operating perspective for 10 years. And it happens that was exactly bracketed by the CD format. And the 90s and the CD, and I think a lot of ways have colored the discourse and expectations for creators, because the CD was a con job that for 10 years music consumers bought into and then had essentially a violent reaction to with Napster. And then I think, like I say, I think now people, it's just more common, the kind of having a rental relationship with a service for whatever reason is something that has been normalized, but these normalization periods are really what's kind of interesting in terms of economic behavior. But and so my association at Sub Pop was really the CD era, and it was an interesting time because what you basically had, and I think people need to know this when they think about music culture, is the economics of music culture, is that an LP album cost about $4 or $5. Each unit cost about $4 or $5. And so when you sold that through a distributor for say $9 or $10, the distributor got 15 or something percent, and depending on the contract you had with the label that put the money up to manufacture it, basically there was only like $1 or $2 for the label and the artist to split. The CD only cost $1 to make, and because of the promise that it was like a vinyl LP that could never, when they came out, it was like, oh, you can leave it on the dashboard of your car and it won't skip. It's basically indestructible, permanent. Digital sound was supposedly perfect. It was like, so for that reason, what you used to pay $10 for, now you're going to pay $15 for. So
Yeah.
on both ends, you had enough money that the margin now you could make, either an artist could, eventually people got to make their own CDs and they might make $5 off selling it, selling it for $7, whatever. The point was that the margins were big enough that artists could sustain themselves, and label operators could sustain themselves, small independent operators could sustain themselves on this increased margin, which of course was destroyed by Napster when you're downloading it for free. In many ways, people started to react to the fact that, like, why am I expected to pay $15 for this work when is it worth
Yeah.
it? And I have to say, from the inside, I mean, I stepped away from Sub Pop in '99. I did some other projects. I eventually started my own label, but there was a moment where any label that is labels put so much into promotion. The highest paid people in the '90s in particular, I'm sorry to tell old war stories, but in the '90s in particular,
Go
the
for it.
highest paid people on any label's payroll were the radio promoters, whose expense account was all about taking these music directors for commercial radio stations out to dinner and flying them around to see the bands play at concerts and so on. And so a huge amount of money was spent on basically getting these gatekeepers and influencers to support. It was before the term of influencer, but it was getting these people, like, so much of your money was spent on getting these so-called very important people to care about your music, to reach the people they follow. It seemed totally hypocritical to me to be like running a campaign against the enthusiast who was spending hours, like, downloading and listening to the content that you were giving these other jerks away for free, or not for free. You were actually paying, your budget was supporting giving them literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, to have a full-time radio promotions person on staff with their travel and expense account was $300,000-$400,000, at a typical label. And typical labels had multiples of these people. To spend that amount of money and then try to criminalize the kid that loved the music and was trading it and talking it up, like, to me, that was insane. And I always hated the notion that I might, like, sit down on an airplane ride and see a kid with with Napster open on his laptop or whatever, and then, like, have to be a record label executive, like, and go, oh, dude, I just wouldn't be the guy. I would not be the cop. I would not defend property under those circumstances. It was, and look, I don't want to say that people should be ripped off. I'm absolutely not that way. I think, and part of the promise of blockchain is creating more dynamic places for creators to and people who have provided the original materials for music to participate materially in material success that follows from their contributions to the community. And that's a very interesting area that is often where a lot of blockchain energy around music is going.
Hey everyone, just wanted to chime in for a second. If you're enjoying this interview so far and want to be sure that more content like this can be created, you can donate to my efforts through Patreon. So on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist, you can donate $3 per month or more to help me out. At the moment, I've spent more on this 9-month-old project than I've ever earned from it due to hosting costs, so any amount really helps. In the future, I'm hoping to do more complex bits of content, like using video, to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation, and if we put our efforts into it, can actually help us create a new economic system that fights to reverse it and build something better. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Here's the rest of the interview with Rich Jensen. Yeah, maybe that's a good point to transition, because I wanted to ask a bit, since we know that Resonate was looking into using blockchain for a few things, and there are some high level plans. So I was curious about hearing the experience that Resonate has had with looking into blockchain to like supplement the Resonate platform, because I think there are probably some good lessons that maybe other people would be interested in listening to.
Yeah, we've had a number of relationships with folks that are looking at that attribution layer.
So like if you want to use like a clip or a sound, a drum beat from another artist, that other artist is able to track that his track is going to another song, and they can be
Absolutely.
remunerated for it.
I mean, there have been projects, I think of 8stem was one that I was familiar with, that was basically looking at trading attribution at the stem level. So so that bass player or that drummer could be, so that basically it'd be opened up for remixing, but would give proper attribution and a fair trade royalty reward back to the originator. And I think that those are very very interesting. I think that is the future. I also, I'm interested in a good example. We recently started a collaboration with a producer named that goes by Poem Producer, AGF, and we're co-hosting a web project that she's working on called Recon, rec-on.org. And part of my interest in having her active in the community, and again, I really think right now we're focusing on conversations, is she is interested in, and some other folks that I'm working with are interested in, when an image, an audio image or other kind of image is derived from a community source, like I have friends that do video production where out of projects related to, say, civil rights monuments in the American Southeast. If you are referencing that community, should they benefit in some way? Or producers that use indigenous sources or popularly found sources. This is something of great interest to Poem Producer, and figuring out, just trying to ask the questions to lead to a community that can come up with a set of practices around this area is very interesting to me. And I think some of these blockchain sourcing, source certification models are very useful. But again, right now, my focus is on the community. How are we aligned with indigenous communities with a long-term solidarity economic framework? The people that are active thinking about those things are the right people to be supporting through whatever economic practices we're able to mobilize, and to be boosting. So right now, some of our alliances are related to those specific kinds of projects, and finding out how to get the conversation going so that the solutions that work for our community can be translated for other communities. And the people that have been offering long-term economic cultural solutions, who I would say would be the people that have been colonized by the property movement that moved out of Western Europe 500 years ago, basically seeing how those people are imagining long-term community futures and management of space. I think there's an interesting movement called ICCA, which are basically territories of life, which are like several dozen very rich locations in the biosphere that are managed by the traditional people who have lived for millennia in those spaces, reinforcing them from property-based encroachments or state encroachments, so that they have a voice at the table in how global society is formed. I think that's absolutely crucial in this moment. And that's the kind of thing that I really felt was missing from some of the amazing technological circles that I started to join once, I was introduced through our chain and Resonate, to start to have some of these technical meetings. I just felt like there were people in the world that actually had a lot to bring to the conversation that didn't know about where these tools were going and what their capacities would be, and that these tools, they had to be participating in the conversation because, it's a, like I said, I think before we started recording, we don't want the kind of empirical reinforcement that blockchain offers. We don't want that to be a reactionary reinforcement. We don't want to lock in the property-based contracts that basically, if you look at property, it's very interesting, what the papal bull of 1492 basically gave, the Pope gave the Spaniards the license to half of the world, that contract, it was when Spain lost to Britain, and then in the Treaty of Westphalia, those are the contracts that are reinforced by Western culture, and they're basically wholly made out of cloth. They're made out of one guy saying that he had a divine relationship, or he had a unique relationship to the divine, and authenticated this contract that the rest of the world, like our economies, are based on. It's not legitimate. So we need to have conversations now where we go, hey, maybe we can't even solve this problem, but who's in the world? Who's at the table? How can we work amongst each other as human beings alive in the moment for best equitable situation, for best resolving the next 10 years of ecological social crisis that we're facing? We're either going to fuck it up or we're going to make it work in the next 10 years. I think a lot of people get that. And the people that should be involved in the technical solutions are around, but they aren't necessarily at the table where those solutions are being crafted. So anyway, we're dedicated to having music be the frame, and the people that are around emerging music and creating music, who, by the way, could make a new industry on their own. That to me is very interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing about, I'm actually interested in contracts where, for example, you might have public performance of our content on Resonate to specific locations, cafes or universities who would then get involved in the community's content freely provided by creators who have the right to engage in such relationships. There's nothing that stops people, which is basically what some of these legacy organizations do, but they take a they take a cut, and they support the lawyers and administrators that litigate over the property rights in those contracts. I think we may be at a point of being able to imagine different sort of service-based relationships around these things, and it's what you control. It's not necessarily a right of property, but it's like, I did do this work. Based on what I have, then I should be, whatever its economic benefit is, I should be entitled to a share, and a community that respects that proposition. Basically, if we can use blockchain to take out the overhead costs of administration and judicial action, legislation, all of these things that cost a lot of money, and have communities that are tied to being supported by those renting streams that may have provided that probably provide a very good function for historical intellectual property. But what that means, intellectual service might be a different kind of relationship that living creators who have an eye on the future, want to engage. And so really interested in reaching out to people that are thinking in those ways.
So then really it's interesting because you take, I guess, inspiration from sort of decolonial sort of movements as for like the use of blockchain technology. Whereas I mean, I agree for sure. Right now, sort of the overall trend you see in blockchain is more about cementing the like already existing shitty hierarchies that are inherent to capitalism, rather than, which is what I think is the goal of what I'm doing and like what the people that I try to speak to, I think a lot of the time, is to create alternatives to that that are more fair, that are more equitable, that can look into reversing those sort of historical sins, which I think is really interesting. And then using a track, or a sample from a track of a musician as like a very small, like mini laboratory for this sort of, yeah, like the ability to give ownership to the original rights owner, I guess, is really interesting and really cool.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of cases communities are willing to have dialogue, but it's when you show up with a writ that says you have to vacate, and here's our guns to support this.
Yeah, that as well.
That's the problem. But until then, the conversation can be very interesting, and a lot of, I think that's where the world is at right now. I think we can instantiate a decolonial world. I think there are people that can have. I think most people are want to have a conversation, but they want their history to be recognized. Mm-hmm. They want their trauma to be acknowledged and repaired, and that shouldn't be scary. Those processes need not be scary. I mean, maybe there's some people that have to go through a shaming process, but you know what? You get to live on the other side of that, and you can make new friends.
I mean, you could. I think right now we're sort of in that moment of history a bit, with all the Black Lives Matter protests going on. It is sort of it is the oppressed and that are wanting to have their voices heard and are having to do that, even under the threat of even more violence than they probably get.
I find it fascinating. It's like there are older progressives who are probably baby boom era who are saying things like defund is an unreasonable proposition.
Oh, that's crazy to me.
And so that's what's interesting is who gets to decide the boundaries of reasonableness in these social discussions? Because younger people don't have that hang up. Like younger people are like, actually, younger people already live in the future. I mean, that's the thing about it. That's why music is so important. Is it doesn't take much to make a profound spatial instantiation of the future through music, because you're already thinking. The creator is already in a different geography. They're already bringing back a world that hasn't yet emerged, that they've experienced in their interior that they're exteriorizing. And then the people that want to be in that world, all they have to do is access that space. And the young are adept at this. They don't the young don't expect to be billionaires. I mean, we supposedly, a lot of where capitalists are at, it's very funny because capitalism started as a reaction to aristocracy, to the divine right of like, I got born, that was God saying, I get to be the one that bosses everybody around. And capitalism was like, no, by our industry and intuition, we should actually organize society. But what's happening, of course, is the capitalists are trying to be the new aristocrats and run everything. And meanwhile, the 99.9% are standing around saying, what the fuck? This is bullshit. And I was saying, and young people already live in the future, and they already are like, yes, the police are a uncontrolled paramilitary organization reinforcing the original racism of our society. Turn off the spigot to those people. The problems that nominally they're there to solve, we can probably solve other ways. But why are we reinforcing? Why are we doubling down on that? Defund is the appropriate term. Meanwhile, older people who maybe they bought houses because they grew up in a time where that was possible and college was free, and a lot of people my age and older are like, oh, defund. Oh, we don't mean defund. Like, who gets to determine what's reasonable and not? Like, right now we're watching this is what you kind of get, or the passage of generations. And I'm absolutely intergenerationalist. I absolutely want young people and old people working together in the dialogue about the construction of the world. But we are watching, one of the things about cultural tipping points, and, I observed this, it's crazy to watch in my time out in the Northwest in Seattle, but, grunge was just kids not dressing up. And when it was crazy when Marc Jacobs came out with the grunge collection worldwide in Paris in '92, and you were selling flannel shirts for $400. Like, the fact of the matter is, culture is organic. It is real. Our existential crisis is real. It's about who you include in the conversation and who gets to determine what things are too scary to talk about. And we are witnessing, and the thing about it is that when the culture tips, it's always, oh, that's impossible, until it tips, and then everybody's like, oh, well, of course that happened. That was no big deal. And we're watching that happen again and again and again. And we should give up on those thresholds and just get to what do we need to do, and what are the projects to get it done. And I like the co-op model as a way for people to organize and do that. And I do like the technical. One of the things that's been beautiful to watch in the blockchain culture is forking. I'm pro forking. Like, forking should be something that more like that's a technical culture idea that and probably has anthropological antecedents. It's like, without getting into the trauma, I mean, from the civilizational side, America was a British fork, but we don't have the space to do that kind of forking. But we may have the discursive space to learn how to create structures that we can share. But I don't want to talk to you anymore, so you go over there. We're going to build a different way, but we're going to share some of these resources on a global level. That doesn't seem unsolvable to me.
That's really interesting. Interesting way of looking at it sometimes. Yeah, the U.S. is a bit of a fork of the U.K. or the British Empire. Yeah,
it is, and we're kind of I think we want to have revolution all the time. I mean, I think iteration is scary, but if you could imagine constantly iterating and having the discourse through those iterations. I think we've got 10 years to figure it out. I think the material models are there, like a sonic boom or whatever. I mean, there's just these, as you get to these boundary states, things get really confusing. But it's really, the issue is emotion and again, who's in the room? Who are you? I want more homeless people or people that are not housed. I mean, I want them housed. I want people to be able to move up from lowest Maslow's level, but I want the work that the co-op is doing to be supporting the people that are being oppressed by the world system at this time and being left out. I think, I very much follow Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as a model for, if you're not actively reducing oppression, or which is to say, giving voice to the oppressed, then you're perpetuating the system by which they are oppressed. These are some of the guide points that I'm following to build a community that exists in this technical space, so that we are building, as we approach technical solutions to some of these community-based problems, we are respecting the whole community. You can kind of tell when the community's not in the room.
Yeah.
Tell when it's a group of people on the team that are all of a particular persuasion and missing out on the skills by which You recognize that people aren't in the room, and then you go get them and bring them into the room. Like that's the skill that technical teams need right now, comprehensively. And I think a lot of people know it, but they don't, or they know it, but they don't know how to do it, and maybe they haven't recognized. A lot of people think that they can just build the technical solution and then drop it into the world, and all bad things disappear. We have to go out and see what the people already on the ground want, and help them make the solution. So.
Yeah, I did want to ask you, since Resonate is a cooperative model, and it gives artists presumably a bit more freedom than compared to like a Spotify model would. But I was curious, what has been the response so far of artists that are now on Resonate, have their music available there?
We're very much in the midpoint. There was, because of our association with the Blockchain Project, in 2018, the organization got to fund itself and get its message out to a certain degree. That relationship ended, part of the crypto crash of 2018. The partnership that we had is no longer active, but a basic community was achieved, and a basic sort of position was mapped out. Peter, our founder, who got us that far, had a second baby and has stepped back and is now an active sort of board member. But out of conversations with him and I stepped in to see what I could do for the community. And your question as to, so where we're at now is, I think we're very aspirational. I've expressed my aspirations, and they are technical, but they're technical within a social framework. Right now, we just need folks to help with the building. We need, right now it's very much an MVP. There is music to hear. There is new content going up. We're opening new relationships in this sort of communitarian framework with artists that want to build with those givens. A lot of artists are very concerned about the appearance of success. So there are a lot of artists that are very guarded about working with an aspirational project, which also, and because we don't have a lot of features, it's hard and I've been very careful about ringing the bell for us, because I want people who do want to build with us and want to be pioneers with us as we add those features, and to realize where we are and where we can go. But we're getting the message out. So I would say, I think artists love us, but and we're building great relationships, but it's hard for listeners to participate. And a lot of my energy right now is in, we're looking for funding sources and messaging to come out, to find people to support us as we are, help build, and also just use. And, I think it's very important to have, I'm really interested in building the curation layer. We have some programs that we'll be rolling out this summer, which are essentially storytelling about artists and work that's appearing in the co-op that's already there, and then dedicated to telling those stories, so that curation layer, by having different curators that come from very different communities and perspectives on music, but referencing our archive, it basically recreates that radio station that that was so instrumental to me in the 80s. So it's like, if our archive is an archive of the emergent creators that want to facilitate, we eat our own dog food, and we become that community that's committed to culture and committed to that bottom-up community, and it's the place to hang out and reference for all these ends. And if nothing else, perhaps we inspire other communities to do the same, and we get more of this stuff going on this planet in this critical time.
I've used the Resonate platform a little bit, and I found it pretty. I mean, if you know how to use Spotify, I mean, you pretty much know how to use Resonate, I think.
Yeah.
It's pretty. It was pretty interesting platform to use. I enjoyed my time.
Let's come back. Let's love to host the Blockchain Socialist. You could
All right,
archive.
if you want to, if you want podcasts, I'm willing to.
Yeah, no, that's actually like when I say curatorial layer, like I'm imagining. Yeah. Anyway, let's talk. We'll talk after the call.
All right, we will. So maybe the last question is where do people how do they use or get on to the platform on Resonate, and where do they find more information about you?
Yeah, you'll find us. It's simply Resonate spelled out with .is. Presently, that's our main server. You can get some samples and some information about what we're doing. Become a member for €5. You get a small amount of listening credits, but you're also a member. You get access to our community. We do have community calls every Wednesday. It's, let's see, Central European time. I believe it's 5 p.m., 4 p.m. in Britain, 9 a.m. on the West Coast where I am. Open to curious folks or who want to figure out. It's a time where, somebody with a few hours to spare on a regular basis could really make an impact to the community. If you like the kinds of things I'm talking about here, or you want to get involved in the conversation, to my way of thinking, one of the advantages of co-op and what it means to be democratically managed is facilitating that ongoing critical discourse about where do we as a collectivity go? And our particular intersection, the particular tripod for us is a critical discussion of what is music, what are the technologies that are socially advantageous in this critical time, and then how do we govern that? So it's music, technology, and governance, and keeping that conversation going, and then having a position from which to instantiate it as a community. That's our, that's the whole. That in a nutshell is the work of the co-op.
Super interesting conversation. I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Maybe one last question. I actually was curious if you ever got to meet Kurt Cobain while he was in part of the Seattle scene.
We have some very close friends in common. I want to say before I say anything that I was so traumatized by his death, I couldn't listen to any of his music for years. I did meet him on a couple of occasions. I haven't really talked about that in public, and I don't feel like doing it. But yeah, he was a little bit younger than me. He was coming up in the milieu that I've described, the Pacific Northwest punk rock area, and that community of, now, like I say, most of the music I think would be called post-punk, but independent music of, which has since become indie, which is another whole discussion about that as a marketing commodity or a marketing tag, a hashtag. Indie was like certain tropes taken from this independent music, which was critical of production. So the socioeconomic conditions of production, not at all dealing with aesthetics. Indie became an aesthetic trope, which in a lot of ways was about defining a particular community as opposed to other communities. I would just say, like, look at underground hip hop, look at independent hip hop as an example of, a place to go that kind of runs against the typical connotations of the indie trope. And I think it's really vital. So anyway, where was I going? I was saying that in the particular local independent music, diverse independent music culture, which was like a few thousand people, young people building their own music economy in the Northwest, Kurt and Chris and his friends and the venues in Olympia, Sub Pop, all that stuff, was the raw material, the raw social material that definitely is my heritage and that he was a product of. And as that, his death was absolutely tragic. It affected all of us enormously. really wish the cat had some other friends. I think it would have helped him out. And yeah, I really hope that whoever, we don't need, I encourage people to look at Kurt's interviews. You kind of get a sense of the personality, and I think that personality is there's a lot of kids in that position, and they shouldn't be as hard on themselves. They should be as ambitious. They should be as open, remaining critical. And honestly, I don't know. I was just up at the one can laugh about these things. It's Don Quixote is this ancient text about tilting at windmills and having these ideals and believing in the world. And it's ironic because that's actually kind of the process by which, we imagine where the culture is going first and then we instantiate it. I say that as a preface to the fact that, like, yesterday I was up at the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. It was created 3 nights ago, when after a week of the police at the East Precinct in Seattle bombarding protesters supporting themes like defund the police and abolish the police and Black Lives Matter, and remembering the horrendous chain of atrocities that have befallen people of color in the United States at the hands of police. They're being bombarded by tear gas for a week. And finally, the East Precinct, I don't know if folks know this, but the police chief, they gave up the precinct. They just abandoned the place. And so the barricades are still left up. And now the protesters are organizing an autonomous zone and having public meetings. It's very familiar. Visitors to Occupy might feel it, but it's Black youth-led, a criticism, confronting the institutions of oppression in our town. My point, to bring this back to Kurt Cobain, is when I'm up there, I look around and I see 1,000 Kurt Cobains. So it's not, one has to be, a good reader. Be a good reader. Draw from Kurt Cobain, but don't try to be him. I mean, don't be him 30 years later. But there's something about, you can learn from his position in the world and attempt to take things on, and then the degree to which, following your own voice and keep pushing, amazing things can happen. The world can be changed. We can contribute to the restructuring of the culture in the world. That's a debate. People could say that he got co-opted and he's just another, he's the James Dean of his era, another iconic empty signal. That's not how I felt after the years he was dead. And the fact that, I have a daughter now that's 15, and she doesn't listen to Nirvana, but she knows who Kurt is. And he still is respected by young people. And I think that's great. I think there is something to be learned. And don't go out like him, though. Like,
no, of course not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I was, he was very inspirational for me when I was young as well. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a really interesting conversation. Maybe we can do it again another time.
Love to work with you more. Really appreciate the inquiry you're bringing. Thank you.